Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into a quieter corner of history, the medieval village where ordinary people lived lives shaped by rhythms we've largely forgotten. This isn't a story of dramatic battles or grand courts, but rather of the subtle, persistent costs of simply existing in a world very different from our own. So before we begin this contemplative journey through medieval life, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you appreciate thoughtful historical exploration. And let me know in the comments where you're joining us from and what time it is there. It's always meaningful to connect with fellow history enthusiasts across different places and hours. Now, perhaps as evening settles in wherever you are, let's ease into this exploration of what survival truly meant for those who lived in the villages of medieval Europe. When we imagine the cost of staying alive, we tend to think in monetary terms, the price of food, shelter, and basic necessities. But for those who lived in medieval villages, the costs were measured in currencies we no longer calculate, in hours of backbreaking labour under an indifferent sun, in freedom surrendered to lords and custom, in bodies worn down by relentless physical demands, in dreams deferred or never conceived, in the quiet acceptance of limitations that defined every aspect of existence. The medieval village was not simply a smaller, older version of modern rural communities. It was a different kind of place entirely, operating under economic systems we struggle to fully comprehend, bound by social contracts written nowhere but enforced everywhere, sustained by labour practices that would seem impossible to anyone accustomed to mechanised agriculture, and governed by beliefs that made sense within their world even if they puzzle us in ours. To stay alive in such a place required multiple forms of payment. There was the literal economic cost, the portions of harvest given as tax and tithe, the fees for using the Lord's mill or oven, the fines for minor infractions of manorial law. But beyond these tangible payments lay deeper expenditures, the cost in human energy, in time that could never be reclaimed, in choices never available to make, in potentials never realised. Consider for a moment what it meant to wake each morning in a medieval village. The day ahead was largely predetermined, dictated by the season, by the demands of the agricultural cycle, by obligations to lord and church, by the limitations of technology and the constraints of custom. Your labour belonged, in significant measure, to others. The fruits of that labour would be divided according to rules you had no voice in creating. Your very movement was circumscribed, your occupation inherited, your future mapped by your birth. Yet within these constraints, people lived, loved, raised families, found moments of joy, created communities, maintained dignity, and passed down to their children not just hardship, but also resilience, wisdom, and the countless small skills required to coax life from an often reluctant earth. They paid the costs of survival, and they survived, generation after generation, creating the human continuity that eventually led to us. This exploration is not an exercise in feeling superior to our ancestors or in romanticising their struggles. It is an attempt at understanding, at seeing clearly what medieval village life demanded of those who lived it, at recognising both the burdens they carried and the strength required to carry them, at appreciating the texture of daily existence in a world where staying alive was itself an achievement worthy of notice. The costs we'll examine are many and interconnected. Economic costs that claimed much of what people produced. Physical costs extracted from bodies through unending labour. Social costs paid in constrained freedoms and limited choices. Temporal costs as time itself belonged more to obligation than to personal desire. Spiritual and psychological costs of living within rigid hierarchies and facing uncertainties without the securities we take for granted. We'll walk through the village year, understanding how each season brought its particular demands and expenses. We'll enter the homes where families negotiated survival on minimal resources. We'll stand in the fields where the fundamental bargain of medieval life played out, labour exchanged for the possibility of continued existence. We'll observe the social mechanisms that distributed both burden and support, that enforced hierarchy while also creating community. Throughout, we'll try to maintain a gentle honesty, neither minimising the genuine hardships nor reducing medieval villagers to mere victims of their circumstances. They were people of remarkable capability, navigating a world that demanded everything and offered little security in return. Understanding what it cost them to stay alive illuminates not just their world, but also the privileges and problems of our own. The medieval village awaits our attention, not as a museum display or a simplified morality tale, but as a complex human environment where the price of life was paid daily, in currencies both visible and invisible, by people who deserve our thoughtful consideration across the centuries that separate their experience from ours. Let us begin this contemplative journey, moving slowly through the seasons and situations of medieval village life, understanding with patience and care what it truly cost to remain among the living in that distant, demanding world. At the heart of medieval village life lay a relationship with land that defined nearly everything else, a relationship mediated by labour, shaped by obligation, and governed by customs that had hardened over generations into systems that seemed as natural and immutable as the changing seasons themselves. The land upon which a village stood, and from which its people drew sustenance, belonged not to those who worked it, but to a lord, perhaps a local knight, a baron, a monastery, or even the distant crown. This fundamental arrangement meant that the primary cost of staying alive was accepting that you would labour on earth you could never own, growing food you could not entirely claim, building a life on a foundation that belonged to another. Imagine the medieval peasants' relationship with the soil they turned each spring. Their hands knew every stone in their strips of field, every slight variation in drainage, every place where the earth was particularly rich or stubbornly poor. They could read the land's moods, predict its yields, sense its needs. Yet for all this intimate knowledge, for all the sweat they poured into it, the land was not theirs. It was held from the Lord, who in turn held it from someone higher, in a chain of possession that ascended to the king, and, in theory, to God himself. This arrangement, called feudalism in our history books, though medieval people had no such term, created the basic economic structure of village life. In exchange for being permitted to work certain strips of land, to live in a cottage, to pasture animals on common land, the peasant owed the lord various forms of payment. These dues were the fundamental cost of existence, the baseline price of being allowed to stay alive. The harvest tax took many forms depending on region and period, but commonly claimed between 1/3 and 1/2 of what the peasant family produced. After months of labour, ploughing, planting, tending, harvesting, a substantial portion of the grain would go to the lord's storehouse. This was not optional or negotiable. It was the bedrock obligation, the primary rent for being permitted to exist upon the land. Beyond the harvest share came labour service, days when the peasant worked not on their own strips, but on the lord's demesne, the land the lord kept for his own use. These labour days might number anywhere from a few dozen to over 100 per year, depending on the peasant's status and local custom. During these days, the peasants' own fields waited, their own work was delayed, while they ploughed or planted or harvested for the lord. The timing of labour service often coincided precisely with when work on one's own land was most urgent. Harvest time, when every hour mattered and weather could destroy a crop overnight, was also when the lord demanded hands for his own harvest. The peasant faced an impossible tension: fulfill the obligation or risk punishment, yet in fulfilling it, perhaps lose part of their own harvest to rain or spoilage. Additional fees accumulated like sediment. There was the mill ban, the requirement to grind grain at the lord's mill rather than at home, paying a portion of the flour for the privilege. The oven ban meant bread must be baked in the lord's ovens for a fee. If you needed to use the lord's wine press, olive press, or other equipment, each use carried its cost. Marriage required the lord's permission, and often a payment. Inheritance meant fees to the lord before a son could take over his father's land. If a daughter married and left the manor, a payment might be owed for the loss of a worker. Death itself triggered fees, as the lord claimed the best beast or most valuable possession as a heriot. The return of equipment lent to the peasant for working the land. The church added its own demands, separate from but parallel to the lord's claims. The tithe, theoretically 1/10 of production, went to support the parish priest and the broader church structure. This was presented as voluntary offering but was effectively mandatory, enforced by social pressure, spiritual authority, and ecclesiastical law. The church tithe applied to nearly everything produced: grain, livestock, even the produce from vegetable gardens. The tithe collector appeared at harvest time, measuring and claiming the church's portion. For a family already giving half their grain to the Lord, losing another 1/10 to the church meant living on what remained, often barely sufficient for survival until the next harvest. Beyond regular tithes came other church fees. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals each required payments to the priest. These life cycle events were both spiritually necessary and economically burdensome, creating moments when families had to find resources they barely possessed to meet religious obligations. Holy days and feast days, which dotted the medieval calendar, meant days when labour was forbidden, days of rest in theory, but also days without productive work. For people living close to subsistence, days without work meant days without progress on the endless tasks required for survival. The spiritual rhythm of the church year imposed its own economic costs. The communal nature of village agriculture added layers of complexity to the economic arrangements. Fields were not neatly divided into individual farms, but rather into strips scattered across large open fields. A family might have a dozen or more strips in different locations, some in better soil than others, distributed according to ancient custom meant to ensure fair sharing of good and poor land. This strip system meant that agricultural decisions were communal. When to plant, what to plant, when to harvest. These choices were made collectively, binding the individual to the community's rhythms. Personal innovation or deviation from tradition was difficult. You farmed as your neighbours farmed, at the pace and in the manner the community determined, because your strips intermingled with theirs and your livestock grazed the same common lands. The common lands, meadows for hay, pastures for animals, forests for wood and forage, were shared resources, but access to them was carefully regulated. You could graze a certain number of animals based on how much land you held. You could gather wood for your own use but not for sale. You could collect nuts and berries, but there were limits. These common resources were essential for survival, yet they came with rules and restrictions that made them less common than the name suggested. Animals were wealth in the medieval village, but keeping them had costs. Pigs could forage in woods, chickens could scratch in yards, but cattle and sheep needed pasture and hay. The grazing rights on commons came with obligations, helping maintain fences, participating in the communal herd, following rules about how many animals each household could keep. A family might need more animals than their allocation permitted, but exceeding the limit brought fines or confiscation. The harvest itself, the moment when all the year's labour came to fruition, was bittersweet. Joy at a successful crop mixed with the knowledge that much of it would immediately be claimed by others. The cart carrying grain to the Lord's storehouse carried away security, nutrition, the possibility of a small surplus that might improve life. What remained had to feed the family, provide seed for next year's planting, and last until the next harvest many months away. Calculating the true cost of staying alive requires understanding that medieval peasants lived in a permanent state of extraction. Their labour produced value, but most of that value flowed upward and outward, to lords, to churches, to the various claims that others held on their work. What they kept was often the minimum required to reproduce their labour for another year. Yet within this extractive system there were gradations. Some peasants held more land, owed fewer labour days, enjoyed better terms. Others, the poorest cottagers, held almost nothing, working as labourers on others' land, living even more precariously. The village contained its own hierarchy of relative security and insecurity, with most people occupying an uncertain middle ground. The stability of these arrangements, such as it was, came from custom. Obligations were generally fixed by tradition, rather than subject to arbitrary change. A lord could not, on whim, suddenly demand more rent or additional labour days. The customs of the manor, sometimes recorded in surveys, sometimes simply held in collective memory, provided a framework that both bound the peasant and offered some protection from pure exploitation. But custom was a fragile guardian. When lords needed more revenue, to fund wars, to support increasingly expensive lifestyles, to meet their own obligations to superiors, they found ways to extract more while claiming to respect tradition. New fees appeared, old obligations were reinterpreted, and peasants had little recourse beyond appeal to the very customs that were being undermined. The economic foundation of medieval village life was thus one of constrained survival. The land provided life, but access to that land required surrendering much of what it produced. Labour was the primary wealth the peasant possessed, but that labour enriched others more than themselves. The cost of staying alive was accepting this fundamental imbalance, working within a system that took more than it left, and somehow finding enough in what remained to sustain family and hope for another year. This was the bargain at the heart of medieval existence. Not a fair exchange, not a contract entered freely, but an inherited arrangement that defined the possible. To stay alive meant accepting these terms, meeting these obligations, and finding ways to create a life in the margins left after others had taken their shares. This was the foundation, neither chosen nor escapable, upon which everything else in village life was built. In the medieval village, time itself was a cost, perhaps the most fundamental cost of all. The agricultural year demanded precise expenditures of human hours, each season claiming its due in labour that could not be deferred or delegated. Understanding what it cost to stay alive requires understanding how the calendar governed existence, how the turning of the year was measured not just in months, but in the specific labours each period demanded. Winter arrived not as a time of rest, but as a season of different work. The fields might lie dormant, but life continued with its requirements. Wood needed gathering for fires that would burn through the cold months. Hours spent in the forest, cutting, hauling, splitting, stacking. Each log represented time invested against the eventual need for warmth. The animals required tending through winter. Cattle and sheep brought in from pasture needed hay carried to them daily, water fetched and kept from freezing, manure removed from their shelters. The labour was cold work, numb fingers performing necessary tasks in the dim light of short winter days. These hours could not be skipped. Animals unfed would die, eliminating both wealth and food sources. Inside the cottage, winter was the season for craft work that might generate small income or create necessities. Women spun thread through long evenings, their fingers working by firelight, transforming wool into yarn that might be woven or sold. Men repaired tools, wove baskets, carved implements. Children learned these skills by watching and imitating, their small hands contributing what they could. The winter diet, dependent on what had been preserved from autumn, required careful management. Grain stored in sacks or bins needed protection from moisture and vermin. Salted meat hanging from rafters, root vegetables buried in earth, these stores had to last until spring brought new food. The time spent checking, rotating, protecting these supplies was time invested in survival. But winter was also when the Lord's demands might be lighter in some ways, heavier in others. Fewer labour days in the fields, perhaps, but requirements for other services, repairing roads, maintaining ditches, building or repairing structures on the Lord's estate. The cold made such work harder, but the obligation remained regardless of weather. Spring arrived as a crescendo of labour demands. The fields called urgently for attention after winter's pause. Ploughing began as soon as the earth was workable. Heavy, exhausting work behind oxen or horses, turning soil that had hardened over winter. Each strip needed ploughing, and if you lacked your own plough team, you might need to arrange shared labour with neighbours, adding coordination costs to the physical work. Ploughing was followed immediately by harrowing to break up clods, then planting, seeds carefully rationed from last year's harvest, broadcast by hand across the prepared earth. The work was rhythmic but relentless, days blending into each other as the entire village raced to complete planting during the narrow window when conditions were right. Spring was also lambing season, calving time, when animals gave birth and required careful watching. A ewe having difficulty with birth might need human help. A newborn lamb rejected by its mother needed hand feeding. These events didn't wait for convenient moments. They occurred when they occurred, demanding immediate attention regardless of what other work awaited. The Lord's domain needed planting too, and labour service came due precisely when the peasants' own fields most needed attention. The choice was impossible. Delay your own planting to fulfil labour service, or risk punishment for failing to appear when summoned. Most met their obligations and hoped their own fields could wait another day without too much loss. Kitchen gardens near the cottage needed planting. Onions, cabbage, beans, herbs, crops that would supplement the grain harvest and provide variety to the diet. The time spent preparing these gardens, planting and beginning to tend them was time borrowed from other pressing needs, but gardens were too important to neglect. Summer brought its own particular labour demands. Haymaking consumed weeks. Cutting grass in meadows with scythes, spreading it to dry, turning it repeatedly, gathering it before rain could ruin it, carting it to storage for winter animal feed. Every household participated, and every able body was needed. The work was hot, dusty, exhausting, and absolutely essential. The grain fields required weeding, hours spent bent over, pulling unwanted plants that competed with crops. Children often did this work, their small hands moving between grain stalks, but adults supervised and joined in. A field insufficiently weeded would yield less. The time invested in weeding was time invested in survival. Livestock needed moving to different pastures as grass was consumed. Fences needed maintaining to keep animals where they belonged, away from growing crops. Someone had to watch the communal herd, a duty often rotated among families, taking time from other work but necessary to prevent animals from damaging crops or wandering off. Summer was also when maintenance work on the cottage and outbuildings became possible. Thatch needed repairing. Walls that had weathered winter might need patching. Fences around gardens required attention. These tasks competed with agricultural labour for the limited hours available. Autumn arrived with the harvest, the culmination of the year's work and the most intensive labour period. Grain harvest required all hands, cutting with sickles, binding into sheaves, stacking in shocks to dry, carting to storage. The weather governed everything. Rain could ruin a harvest, so work proceeded frantically when conditions were dry. The physical toll of harvest was immense, bending to cut grain, arms working endlessly, backs straining to lift and carry, bodies pushed to their limits day after day. Hours extended as long as light permitted, because every hour mattered when your survival depended on bringing in the crop before weather destroyed it. But harvest time was also when the Lord's claims became most visible. His officials appeared to measure and collect his share, to ensure labour service for his harvest was performed, to enforce all the obligations that the year's labour had created. The busiest, most crucial time for the peasant was also the time when others' demands were most pressing. After grain came other harvests, grapes where vineyards existed, apples and pears from orchards, nuts from woods. Each had its proper time, its particular labour requirement. Missing the right moment for any harvest meant losing part of what the year had produced. Threshing followed harvest, separating grain from chaff, through long hours of beating with flails. The work could extend through winter, often done indoors when weather prevented outdoor labour. The rhythmic striking, the dust, the repetitive motion, all required hours that might number in the hundreds before the year's grain was fully processed. Autumn was also slaughter time for animals that couldn't be fed through winter. The work of butchering, preserving meat through salting or smoking, preparing sausages, rendering fat, all of this was skilled labour requiring time and attention. The results would feed the family through winter, making the time invested crucial. Throughout all seasons, daily tasks continued regardless of what other work demanded attention. Water needed carrying, fires needed tending, meals needed preparing, children needed minding. These maintenance activities of life consumed hours that were invisible in records but essential to existence. Women's work, often undercounted in historical records, filled every moment. Beyond field labour, they managed households, cooking, cleaning, caring for children, tending gardens, preserving food, spinning, weaving, making and mending clothes. Their work had no season of diminishment. It continued constantly, layered upon agricultural labours. Children's time was also claimed by necessity. From early ages they contributed, watching younger siblings, herding geese, gathering eggs, helping in fields and gardens. Their education was practical, learned through participation in the work that sustained life. Play existed in stolen moments, brief intervals between tasks. The elderly and infirm contributed what they could, tasks suited to limited mobility or strength. Sitting work like carding wool, shelling beans, minding fires. Their time was still economically necessary, their contributions, however small, part of the household's total labour. The calculation of time's cost reveals a life where leisure was rare and carefully bounded. Church festivals and holy days provided breaks from labour, but even these weren't entirely free. They came with their own activities, obligations and social expectations. True rest, time belonging entirely to oneself, was a luxury few could afford. The seasonal cycle was also unpredictable, a late spring delayed planting compressing the season's work. Early frost threatened autumn crops. Too much rain or too little could disrupt the careful timing that agriculture required. These uncertainties meant that time's demands were not just heavy but variable, sometimes requiring even greater expenditures than usual. The opportunity cost of time was particularly poignant. Hours spent meeting the Lord's labour service were hours not spent improving one's own land. Time given to required tasks was time not available for anything that might transcend mere survival. For craft that might bring small income, for small improvements to cottage or tools, for any activity beyond the minimum required to stay alive. Understanding time as currency helps us see that medieval villagers were, in a very real sense, spending their lives, not metaphorically, but literally, in measured hours and days, in physical labour that consumed their mortal time on earth. The cost of staying alive was not just economic or physical, but temporal, the expenditure of the only truly irreplaceable resource any human possesses. This temporal cost was perhaps the heaviest burden of all, because it was absolute. Time given could never be reclaimed. Days spent in the Lord's fields were days removed from one's own life. Hours consumed by endless necessary labour were hours that could never be lived differently. The medieval villager spent their time to stay alive, and in doing so spent the substance of life itself. To speak of what it cost to stay alive in a medieval village is to speak, fundamentally, of what happened to human bodies, how they were shaped, used, worn down, and sometimes broken by the demands of survival. The physical cost was written on every body, visible in posture and movement, in hands and backs, in faces aged beyond their years. Consider the fundamental instrument of medieval village life, the human body in labour. Without machines to multiply human force, without animals sufficient for every task, the body itself was the primary tool, the plough, the harvester, the processor of materials, the carrier of burdens. Every task asked something of flesh and bone, muscle and joint. The spine bore witness to a lifetime of agricultural work, bending to plant, to weed, to harvest. These motions, repeated thousands upon thousands of times across years, created characteristic curvature. The back that had been straight in youth gradually acquired the shape of the labour it performed, curving forward, losing flexibility, developing chronic pain that became as familiar as breathing. By middle age, many villagers walked with a permanent stoop, bodies remembering the positions they had held most often. Rising from bed in the morning involved negotiation with a back that resisted straightening, muscles and joints protesting the shift from rest to upright posture. This wasn't occasionally painful, it was the constant state, the baseline from which more acute pains occasionally emerged. The hands told their own story, calluses built up where tools pressed against skin, thick pads on palms, rough patches on fingers. These protective layers were necessary adaptations, the body's response to constant friction and pressure. But calluses could crack, particularly in cold weather, creating painful fissures that nonetheless didn't excuse one from continued work. Fingernails became thick and damaged from agricultural labour, broken by stones in fields, ground down by rough work. The fine motor control required for delicate tasks became difficult, as joints thickened with age and use. Arthritis was not an unusual condition, but rather an expected development, the predictable result of decades of repetitive stress. The shoulders and arms developed their own accommodations to constant labour. Muscles built strength in specific patterns, determined by the work performed, strong in some movements, less so in others. This created imbalances that contributed to injury and chronic pain. A shoulder repeatedly stressed by scything or flail work might develop persistent problems, painful reminders with every movement. The feet, often inadequately protected by rough footwear or going bare, bore the weight of constant standing and walking on uneven ground. Arches might collapse under years of load-bearing. Toes could be broken by dropped tools or kicking stones while ploughing, then heal imperfectly, creating permanent deformities. Walking itself could become painful, though walking was too necessary to avoid. The knees, subjected to years of kneeling to plant or weed, of rising and squatting countless times daily, wore down gradually. The cartilage that cushioned joints degraded, creating bone-on-bone friction that made every step hurt. Yet the work continued because it had to, pain acknowledged but not accommodated. Women's bodies bore additional costs. Pregnancy and childbirth were frequent, each instance placing enormous stress on the body. Carrying children while continuing to work in fields and gardens, lifting and bending while pregnant, Resuming full labour shortly after birth, these demands left their marks. Pelvic injuries from difficult births, weakened abdominal walls from multiple pregnancies, these physical costs accumulated. The nutritional deficits that many villagers experienced compounded the physical toll. Bodies asked to perform heavy labour while receiving insufficient calories cannibalised their own muscle tissue. Inadequate protein meant slower recovery from injury. Vitamin and mineral deficiencies affected bone strength, healing capacity and resistance to disease. Children's bodies, pressed into labour from early ages, bore costs that affected their development. Spines subjected to heavy carrying while still growing might develop improperly. Growth could be stunted by the combination of hard labour and insufficient nutrition. The robust development that adequate childhood rest and food would permit was often impossible. Accidents and injuries were common consequences of agricultural labour. A foot cut by a scythe, a hand crushed between cart and gate, a back strained while lifting, these acute injuries occurred regularly. Without effective medical treatment, they healed as well as they could, often imperfectly, leaving permanent limitations or chronic pain. Repetitive stress injuries, though not called by that name, were endemic. The same motions performed daily for years created predictable damage. Tendons inflamed, joints degraded, nerves compressed. These conditions worsened over time, each year adding to the accumulated damage until even simple movements became difficult. The respiratory system suffered from various insults: dust from threshing grain, smoke from indoor fires, mould from damp living conditions, all affected lungs over time. Chronic coughs were common, breathing could become laboured, and respiratory capacity diminished, making physical labour even more difficult. Dental health deteriorated with age, but teeth were essential tools for survival, used not just for eating but for holding materials while working. For processing food that came in tough or hard forms, teeth wore down, broke, or rotted. The pain of dental problems was endured because there was little that could be done beyond extracting badly decayed teeth. Vision changes with age affected everyone, but for medieval villagers, the loss of clear sight had practical implications. Close work became difficult, threading needles, making fine repairs. Distance vision impairment made certain tasks dangerous. There were no corrective lenses for peasants. One simply adapted to diminishing vision as best one could. Hearing loss from years of exposure to various noises, the striking of tools, the sounds of animals, the general acoustic environment of agricultural life, gradually reduced auditory acuity. This social isolation added to the physical toll, making communication more difficult just when the wisdom of experience might be most valuable. The skin bore witness to a lifetime of outdoor exposure. Weathered and lined far beyond chronological age, damaged by sun and wind, marked by countless small scars from minor injuries, the skin showed the years of labour. Conditions like melanomas or other sun-related damage could develop, recognised as problems but untreatable. Hernias were common, the result of heavy lifting and straining. The protrusion of internal organs through weakened abdominal walls created visible bulges, often painful, sometimes dangerous. These might be managed with binding or support, but surgical repair was not available. One lived with the condition, limited by it, working around it. Varicose veins developed from long hours of standing, from repeated pregnancies, from the strain of labour. The aching, swollen vessels were not merely cosmetic problems, but sources of real discomfort and potential complications. Legs might throb after a day's work, the pain making even rest uncomfortable. The general fatigue of bodies used hard for years was a constant companion. Not the pleasant tiredness after good exercise, but a deep bone-level exhaustion that sleep could only partially address. Waking tired, working tired, going to bed exhausted. This was the rhythm for many, their bodies never fully recovering before the next day's demands. Yet there was also a certain capability that came from a lifetime of physical labour. Bodies adapted, becoming efficient at the specific tasks required. Muscles developed precisely where needed for the work performed. There was a kind of functional fitness, different from modern athletic conditioning but effective for its purposes. The knowledge of the body's limits and capacities was intimate. People understood what they could and couldn't do, how to pace themselves to last through a day, which pains were warnings and which were simply the background noise of existence. This physical literacy was survival knowledge. learned through years of attention to bodily signals. Some bodies proved more resilient than others. Genetic variation, early nutrition, the particular work performed, the luck of avoiding serious injury, all contributed to how well a person withstood the physical costs. Some remained relatively strong into advanced age, others were broken by middle years. The variation was visible in any village gathering. The elderly, those who survived long enough to reach old age, often bore the accumulated physical costs most visibly. Bent, often in pain, limited in movement, they nonetheless contributed what they could. Lighter tasks, supervisory roles, the passing on of knowledge. Their bodies were testimonies to what survival had required. Understanding the physical toll helps us comprehend why life expectancy was short by modern standards. It wasn't just disease or poor sanitation, though those contributed. It was also that bodies wore out, used up by the relentless demands of staying alive. The machine of the human body, operated at maximum capacity for decades, simply broke down. The physical cost of staying alive was thus not a single payment, but an ongoing expenditure, a slow using up of bodily capacity. Each day's labour drew down the account of physical ability, and while the body replenished what it could, the net balance slowly declined. By the time old age arrived, for those who reached it, much of the physical capital had been spent, invested in the survival that had made it possible to grow old at all. This was perhaps one of the cruelest costs, that survival itself damaged the instrument of survival. To stay alive required using one's body in ways that harmed it, creating a gradual process of wearing down that was both the cost of life and eventually the cause of death. The medieval villager's body was both their most valuable asset and their most significantly depleted resource. Beyond the economic tributes and physical labours, medieval villagers paid another kind of cost for their survival, one measured in constrained choices, limited freedoms, and the acceptance of a social position that was inherited rather than achieved, fixed rather than fluid. Understanding what it cost to stay alive requires examining what people surrendered in terms of autonomy, opportunity, and self-determination. The most fundamental social cost was accepting one's place in a hierarchy that was understood to be divinely ordained and therefore unquestionable. To be born a peasant was to be born into a specific social slot with defined limitations and obligations. Questioning this arrangement was not merely impractical, but was considered spiritually problematic, a form of pride that challenged God's ordering of the world. This acceptance began in childhood. A child learned early that they would follow their father's occupation, work the same land, live in the same village. The imagination was shaped by this reality. Dreams of alternative lives were generally not cultivated because they served no purpose. The social cost included the foreclosure of possibilities before they could even be conceived. The inability to leave one's village without permission represented a profound constraint on freedom. Movement was controlled, not by walls or guards, but by law and custom. A villager who wished to travel, to visit relatives in another region, to seek work elsewhere, to simply see different places, needed the Lord's permission, which might be granted or denied at will. This restriction on movement had practical implications. It meant that opportunities elsewhere were effectively unavailable. If a nearby town offered better work, if another lord had more favourable conditions, these possibilities remained theoretical. One's life was circumscribed by village boundaries that were not just geographic, but legal and social. Marriage required permission from the lord, and this permission came with costs, both fees and the lord's interest in maintaining the population and labour force. If a woman married someone from another manor, the lord lost a worker, so a fee compensated for this loss. Young people's choices about partners were thus filtered through economic calculations not their own. The marriage market itself was constrained by social position. Families of similar status married their children to each other. Significant social climbing through marriage was rare. The person you might love, if from a different social class, was effectively out of reach. Romantic choice was subordinated to social and economic practicality. Inheritance followed rigid patterns that left younger sons with little. The eldest son inherited the family's holding, maintaining its integrity. Younger sons might receive small portions, might become landless labourers, might need to seek positions as servants. Their future was uncertain, their options limited by an accident of birth order. Daughters inherited even less, expected to marry and join their husbands' households. Their labour enriched first their fathers, then their husbands, but they accumulated little for themselves. The social cost for women included this lifetime of enriching others without building independent security. Occupational choice was essentially non-existent. You did what your family did, what your village needed, what your status permitted. If you had aptitude for work that wasn't available within these constraints, that aptitude remained undeveloped. Talents that didn't align with available roles were simply lost, potential unrealised. The voice in governance that we consider essential was completely absent. Decisions about the community were made by the lord or his officials, sometimes in consultation with a few leading peasants, but the majority had no say. Laws they lived under were made without their input. Policies affecting their lives deeply were decided by others. Even within the village, influence was hierarchical. Some families held more land, had better positions, commanded more respect. These leading families had more voice in village affairs, more ability to shape collective decisions. Those at the bottom, cottagers with little land, landless labourers, had minimal influence over even community-level choices. The legal system operated differently for different classes. A peasant who had a dispute with the lord or his officials had little recourse. The courts were run by the lord's representatives. Justice was unlikely to favour the powerless over the powerful. Legal protection was a benefit of status, not a universal right. Crime and punishment reflected social hierarchy. The same offence might be punished differently depending on who committed it. A peasant stealing from the lord faced severe consequences. A lord's official abusing peasants faced little accountability. The social cost included this unequal application of justice, the inability to own property in the full sense, to possess land absolutely, to dispose of it as one wished, represented a fundamental limitation. Everything was held conditionally, subject to obligations limited by custom. Even the cottage and tools, the animals and crops were held precariously, subject to the lord's ultimate ownership. Education, such as it was, reflected and reinforced social position. Peasant children learned practical skills for the life they would lead. Reading and writing, which might open other possibilities, were generally unavailable. The intellectual development that education permits was not cultivated, because it wasn't relevant to the life circumstances that birth had determined. The social cost extended to smaller daily matters. The quality of clothing one could wear was regulated by custom and sometimes by law. Certain colours, fabrics, or styles were reserved for higher classes. Even in personal appearance, one's social position had to be visible, acknowledged, accepted. Public deference to social superiors was required. The peasant encountering the lord or his officials had to show appropriate respect, removing caps, bowing, using proper forms of address. These rituals of subordination were not just courtesy but enforcement of hierarchy, daily reminders of one's place in the social order. The Church reinforced social hierarchy through its teachings. Sermons emphasized that each person had a station in life ordained by God, and that accepting this station with patience was a virtue. Ambition beyond one's place was presented as pride. Acceptance of limitations was framed as humility. The spiritual authority of the Church thus blessed the social order. Festivals and celebrations, while providing relief from work, also reinforced hierarchy. The Lord might provide feast days where peasants were fed, but this generosity demonstrated power relationships. Receiving charity reminded one of dependency. The feast was a gift from above, not a right or reciprocal exchange. Even in rest, in recreation, in the small pleasures available, social position shaped experience. The nobleman hunted, the peasant was forbidden from hunting game. The wealthy enjoyed elaborate meals, the peasant ate simple fare. Every aspect of life reflected and reinforced the social divide. The psychological cost of this limited existence is difficult to measure, but was surely real. Living always within constraints, knowing that circumstances of birth determined life's trajectory, accepting subordination as permanent. These carried emotional weight. Some people undoubtedly chafed against limitations, others internalized them completely. The community itself provided support but also surveillance. Neighbours knew your business, observed your behaviour, judged your choices. The social cohesion that helped people survive also limited privacy and individual freedom. The village was a web of relationships that both sustained and constrained. Shame and honour operated as social controls. Behaving inappropriately for one's station brought shame, not just to oneself but to family. Maintaining honour meant accepting and properly fulfilling one's role. These powerful social emotions enforced conformity, limiting the range of acceptable behaviour. For those with particular gifts, intelligence, creativity, leadership ability, that exceeded what their station could use, the social cost was especially poignant. Capabilities that might have flourished in different circumstances remained dormant. Potential leadership became competent farming. Artistic ability might find outlet only in small craft work. Intellectual capacity was applied to traditional knowledge with no broader scope. Women faced additional social costs beyond those shared with men. Their subordination was double, to the class hierarchy and to male authority within that class. Legal rights, economic autonomy, social respect, all were more limited for women. The cost of staying alive as a woman included accepting this compounded subordination. The elderly, who had paid social costs throughout their lives, found their position increasingly marginal. Respect for age existed, but was balanced against economic realities. When productive capacity declined, social standing often declined with it. The cost of survival in old age sometimes included diminished dignity. Yet within these constraints, people created lives of meaning. Families loved each other. Friendships were deep. Communities found cohesion. Traditions carried significance. The social costs were real, but they didn't prevent the formation of relationships and communities that mattered profoundly to those within them. Understanding the social costs requires recognizing a paradox, that a system which severely limited freedom also created a kind of security. Your place was fixed, but it was a place. You belonged somewhere, had a role, were part of a community. The cost of freedom's absence was partly offset by the security of belonging, however constrained that belonging was. But this security was cold comfort for those who might have wished for more, who felt the weight of limitations, who looked at their lives and saw not just what was, but what might have been under different circumstances. The social costs paid daily in small acceptances of constraint accumulated into lives lived largely on terms others had set. The cost of staying alive in medieval village terms thus included surrendering much of what we consider essential to human dignity: choice, autonomy, opportunity, the chance to shape one's own destiny. These were prices paid not once but constantly, in every constrained decision, every accepted limitation, every acknowledgement of one's fixed social position. To understand the full cost of staying alive in a medieval village requires bringing into focus what was often invisible even to contemporaries: the particular burdens carried by women, the additional layers of work and obligation that fell to them, the specific prices they paid for their own survival and that of their families. The woman's day began before dawn and extended past nightfall, a continuous cycle of tasks that had no defined endpoint because the work of maintaining life was never truly complete. While men's agricultural labour followed seasonal rhythms with periods of intense activity and relative rest, women's work maintained a relentless constancy across all seasons. Consider the preparation of food, not the simple matter of cooking a meal, but the complex process of transforming raw materials into edible sustenance. Grain needed grinding, which meant regular trips to the mill or hours of hand grinding with mortar and pestle or hand quern. The grain then needed to be made into bread or porridge, processes requiring skill, time, and careful attention. Bread making was not a simple matter. Water needed carrying, fires needed building and maintaining, dough needed kneading, heavy physical work that made arms ache. The risen dough needed shaping, and then either baked in the communal oven, requiring transport and perhaps waiting, or cooked over the home fire. The entire process might consume most of a day, yet bread was a staple that needed constant replenishment. Beyond bread, meals required preparation from basic ingredients. Vegetables from the garden needed cleaning, chopping, cooking. Herbs needed gathering and adding. Pottage, the stew that was a dietary staple, required tending, stirring, adding ingredients at proper times. Simple as the final dish might be, creating it demanded attention and labour. Preservation of food was primarily women's work. After harvest, the abundance needed transformation into forms that would last through winter. Vegetables needed pickling or storing in earth. Herbs needed drying. Fruits needed preserving. made into jams if honey or precious sugar was available or dried. Each preservation method required specific knowledge and considerable time. Meat preservation, when animals were slaughtered, was a major undertaking. Salting, smoking, rendering fat. These processes were complex and had to be done correctly or food would spoil. The work was smelly, messy, and physically demanding but essential for winter survival. Dairy work filled many hours. Milk needed processing quickly before it spoiled, made into cheese, butter, or consumed immediately. Cheesemaking was skilled work requiring precise timing and conditions. Butter churning was repetitive, tiring labour that nonetheless had to be done regularly. Water carrying, assigned primarily to women and children, was a constant requirement. Every drop used in the household, for cooking, cleaning, drinking, washing, had to be carried from well or stream. With a heavy bucket in each hand, women made trip after trip, the physical toll accumulating in shoulders, back and arms. Clothing production consumed enormous amounts of women's time. The entire process, from raw material to finished garment, was household work. Wool needed carding to align the fibres, then spinning into thread. Hours of work for enough thread to weave even a small piece of cloth. Flax needed similar processing to become linen thread. Spinning was endless work. The whirl of the spindle, the pull and twist of fingers, the gradual accumulation of thread, this occupied every spare moment. Women spun while watching children, while tending fires, while sitting after dark. The rhythmic motion was so constant that bodies retained the muscle memory across lifetimes. Weaving, if the household had a loom, required different skills. The setup of the loom, the threading of the warp, the passage of the shuttle, the beating of the weft, all required attention and precision. The cloth slowly grew, inches per day of focused work. Without a loom, cloth had to be purchased or bartered for, requiring other labour to earn the means of exchange. Sewing and mending never ended. New garments needed making as children grew or old ones wore out. Existing clothes needed constant repair. Patches upon patches, seams restitched, holes closed. The threadbare state of most clothing meant that mending was perpetual, each garment repeatedly rescued from total disintegration. Household cleanliness, such as it was possible to maintain, required effort. Floors needed sweeping, though with earthen floors this meant controlling dust rather than achieving cleanliness. Cooking implements needed cleaning, bedding needed airing. The work fought a losing battle against the dirt that was inevitable in medieval living conditions, but the effort continued nonetheless. Laundry was a major undertaking done perhaps monthly or less frequently. Clothes were soaked, beaten, scrubbed, rinsed in cold water. Hard physical labour that left hands raw and arms aching. The drying required space and decent weather. The infrequency meant that basic cleanliness was maintained more by airing and spot cleaning than by regular washing. Childcare was woven through all other work. Infants needed nursing, which meant work stopped periodically regardless of tasks pending. Toddlers needed watching to keep them from dangers, fires, wells, animals, tools. Older children needed teaching the skills they would need, instruction given while working together. Pregnancy and childbirth added their particular costs. Women continued working through pregnancy. The growing burden of the child carried while performing all regular tasks. Birth itself was dangerous, painful, and without effective medical intervention. Recovery was brief. Work resumed within days of delivery because it had to. The nursing of sick family members fell primarily to women. A sick child needed tending through the night. An injured husband needed care while healing. The elderly in the household, when infirm, required assistance. This care work added to regular duties rather than replacing them. The garden, often considered women's domain, required daily attention during growing season. Watering, weeding, watching for pests, harvesting. These tasks were squeezed into days already full. The garden's produce was essential for dietary diversity, making its tending a necessity rather than a choice. Small animal care, chickens, geese, perhaps a pig, typically belonged to women. Feeding, collecting eggs, managing breeding, processing birds when needed. These were regular responsibilities. The animals represented valuable resources and their care couldn't be neglected. Brewing, where it was done at home, was women's work. The soaking of grain, the preparation of mash, the fermentation, the final processing, Beer production was complex and time-consuming. Where women brewed commercially as alewives, this became a significant labour commitment on top of household duties. Herbalism and folk medicine were often women's knowledge. Gathering healing plants, preparing remedies, treating minor ailments, these skills were developed through experience and passed from mother to daughter. The knowledge was valuable, but acquiring and using it required time. Market work, when women sold surplus from garden or dairy production, added another layer. The journey to market, the time spent selling, the need to manage transactions, all of this was additional to production work. The small income generated was essential for purchasing what the household couldn't produce, but earning it required yet more hours. Seasonal agricultural work was added to women's regular duties. At harvest, during haymaking, when all hands were needed in fields, women worked alongside men. But unlike men, they couldn't set aside household tasks. The meal still needed preparing, children still needed care, the daily maintenance of life continued even as fieldwork demanded attention. The social and emotional labour of maintaining family relationships and community standing fell largely to women. Managing household tensions, maintaining appropriate relationships with neighbours, ensuring children behaved properly, upholding the family's reputation, these invisible tasks required constant attention and skill. Religious observances added their own requirements. Women were responsible for teaching children prayers, maintaining household religious practices, ensuring family attended services appropriately. The spiritual life of the household was women's work to organise and maintain. The lack of rest was perhaps the cruelest aspect. Men's labour, however hard, had endpoints. After ploughing, there was a pause before the next task. After harvest, the season of lighter work. Women's work had no such boundaries. The tasks of maintaining life cycled continuously, one flowing into the next without respite. Sleep itself was fragmented by needs that arose in the night. An infant crying, a sick child, a fire needing tending, these interrupted rest. Women often operated in a state of chronic sleep deprivation, their bodies never fully recovering before the next day's demands began. The economic invisibility of women's work meant it was undervalued despite being essential. The spinning, weaving, food preservation, child-rearing, none of this appeared in economic accounts. It was unpaid, uncounted labour that made all other labour possible. The household and economy functioned on this invisible foundation. The physical toll on women's bodies was as severe as on men's, but differently distributed. Repetitive motions of spinning affected hands and arms. Carrying water and children strained backs. Multiple pregnancies and births damaged pelvic structures. The specific wear was distinct but equally debilitating. Women's marginal economic position, despite their essential labour, meant vulnerability. A widow might lose her household's land. An unmarried woman had few options for support. The work women did, crucial as it was, didn't translate into economic security or legal standing. The cost of staying alive for women thus included not just the work itself, but the invisibility of that work, the lack of recognition, the economic vulnerability despite economic essentiality. They paid in uncounted hours, in fragmented rest, in bodies worn by layered demands, in potential unexplored because all energy went to survival tasks. Yet within these overwhelming demands, women created the texture of daily life. The bread they baked, the clothes they made, the children they raised, these were the substance of existence. Their labour, though uncounted, was noticed in its absence. The cost they paid was enormous, but the value they created was the foundation of everything else. The cost of staying alive in a medieval village was paid not just by adults, but by children, who from their earliest years were incorporated into the economy of survival. Understanding their experience reveals how the village sustained itself across generations, but also what it asked of those least able to bear the burden. Childhood as a protected, separate phase of life, a modern concept, barely existed in the medieval village. Children were small people who would become large people, moving along a continuum rather than passing through a distinct stage. From the moment they could walk and speak, they began contributing to household survival. The very youngest had value primarily as future workers. Infants were nursed by their mothers, who continued other work with babies tied to their bodies. The constant proximity meant that mothers' work shaped infants' earliest experiences. The rhythm of spinning, the sound of cooking, the movement of garden work became the sensory environment of infancy. Toddlers, As soon as they could be trusted with simple tasks, were given responsibilities. Gathering eggs from chickens, feeding geese, carrying small items, watching younger siblings, these tasks were within their capabilities and freed adults for more demanding work. The contribution was real, if small. By age 5 or 6, children were working members of the household. Boys might help in fields, clearing stones, carrying water, watching for birds to scare from crops. Girls joined in household tasks, simple spinning, basic food preparation, helping with laundry. The work was appropriate to their size and strength, but it was genuine labour, not play at working. The education children received was entirely practical. They learned by watching and doing, acquiring skills through participation rather than formal instruction. A girl learned to spin by trying to spin, corrected by her mother until the skill developed. A boy learned to use tools by using them, under his father's supervision. This apprenticeship model of learning was efficient for transmitting practical knowledge, but limited intellectual development to what was immediately useful. Reading and writing, being unnecessary for agricultural labour, were generally not taught. Arithmetic beyond basic counting was similarly absent. The mind was trained for the work it would do, and no further. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural work shaped children's years. Spring and summer meant more outdoor work. They helped with planting, weeding, watching animals. Autumn harvest demanded all hands. Children worked long hours gathering, gleaning, helping however they could. Winter brought different tasks, perhaps more time for indoor work, learning crafts, helping process stored foods. The physical demands on growing bodies were significant. Carrying weights beyond what was appropriate for developing spines, repetitive motions affecting growing joints, inadequate rest during intensive work periods, all of this shaped physical development. Children often showed signs of the labour they performed: calloused hands, developing postural problems, the marks of their work visible on their bodies. Nutrition for children was often inadequate. Growing bodies need substantial nutrition, but in households struggling to feed everyone, children might receive less than needed. The largest portions went to adult workers, whose labour was immediately essential. Children got what remained, which might not support optimal growth. The result was that many children were smaller and less robust than their genetic potential would have allowed. Stunted growth, delayed development, reduced resistance to disease. These were common. The children survived, which was the goal, but they survived as diminished versions of what they might have been under better conditions. Illnesses affected children severely, and childhood diseases carried high mortality. Without effective medical treatment, common childhood ailments could be fatal. Parents might raise 6 or 7 children knowing that only 3 or 4 would survive to adulthood. This terrible arithmetic was simply accepted as the way of things. The emotional cost of high child mortality is difficult to assess from historical distance, but surely it marked both parents and surviving children. The death of siblings was a common experience, shaping children's understanding of life's fragility. They learned young that survival was uncertain, that death was always near. Play existed but was constrained and limited. Children created games from whatever was available, simple toys made from scraps, activities that required no equipment. But playtime was brief, stolen between tasks, ending when work called. The long, unstructured play that characterises modern childhood was largely absent. The games children did play often mimicked adult work, playing at farming, at household tasks, at the roles they would assume. Even recreation served as training, preparing them for their future responsibilities. The distinction between play and preparation was blurry. Children's relationships with parents were shaped by the demands of survival. Love surely existed, but it was expressed within a framework of authority and utility. Parents needed children's labour, needed them to obey, needed them to grow into capable workers. Affection coexisted with these practical requirements, but couldn't override them. Discipline was physical and immediate. A child who didn't work adequately, who was disobedient, who shirked duties might be struck. This wasn't considered abusive, but proper child rearing. Children needed to learn obedience and diligence, and physical punishment was an accepted teaching method. The transition from childhood to adult responsibilities was gradual rather than marked by clear ceremonies. There was no sudden moment of becoming adult. Rather, children took on increasingly demanding tasks, more hours of work, fuller responsibilities, until they were simply functioning as adults. Marriage might mark official adulthood, but the role was assumed well before. For boys, this meant eventually taking over the family holding or finding some other position. The eldest son had a clear path. He would inherit and continue what his father had done. Younger sons faced uncertainty. Without inheritance, they needed to find their place, perhaps as labourers, perhaps marrying into families that lacked sons, perhaps leaving the village if opportunity and permission aligned. For girls, the path led to marriage and joining another household. Their childhood labour in their natal family was preparation for a lifetime of similar labour in their husband's family. They moved from subordination to parents to subordination to husband and mother-in-law, their position shifting but not fundamentally improving. The complete absence of choice about their futures was a cost children paid without necessarily recognising it as such. They couldn't choose their occupation, their location, their life path. These were determined by birth order, gender, family circumstances, and Lord's decisions. The child's own preferences, aptitudes, or desires had no role in shaping their future. Some children showed particular abilities, intelligence, creativity, physical gifts, that might have flourished in different circumstances, but the village had no mechanism for developing talent that didn't align with predetermined roles. A brilliant mind might spend a lifetime in field work. Artistic ability might find expression only in minor craft. Leadership capability might manage only a household. The seasonal rhythm meant that children experienced intensive work periods that left them exhausted. Harvest time, when every hand was needed and work extended from first light to darkness, was particularly demanding. Children worked beyond their endurance because the harvest couldn't wait and every contribution mattered. School, in the rare cases where it existed, was limited to basic literacy and religious instruction, often provided by the village priest. Only a small minority of children received even this minimal education, and it was usually boys from relatively better-off families. For most children, their education was entirely practical and oral. The age at which children were expected to work independently varied, but was generally younger than we would find acceptable. By age 10 or 12, a child might be given significant responsibility. Watching younger siblings for extended periods, managing certain household tasks, handling animals, working in fields without direct supervision. This early assumption of responsibility built competence but also foreclosed childhood. A 12-year-old managing substantial tasks was developing skills and character, but was also missing the protected development that we now understand children need. They grew capable, but perhaps in ways that came at costs we can't fully measure. Children's understanding of the world was shaped by their limited experience. The village and its immediate surroundings were the known world. Beyond that were places they heard of but would likely never see. Their imaginative horizon was bounded by what they could observe and what stories told them. The stories children heard, folk tales, religious narratives, local legends, conveyed messages about accepting one's place, enduring hardship, trusting in divine order. These stories were entertainment, but also socialization, teaching children to understand their world and their position in it. The peer relationships among children were shaped by the same hierarchies that governed adult life. Children of wealthier families had different status than cottagers' children. These social distinctions were learned young and internalized, preparing children for a lifetime of hierarchical relationships. As children approached marriageable age, their labour value increased, but so did their potential cost to the family. Daughters would leave, taking their labour to another household. Sons might need to be established somehow. The parents' investment in raising children came due, and the calculations about their futures became more pressing. The betrothal and marriage of children involved parents making decisions about their futures based on economic and social considerations. A daughter's marriage was negotiated to create beneficial alliances or economic arrangements. The daughter's own feelings about her prospective spouse were considered, if at all, secondary to practical matters. For children who lost parents through death, which was common, the situation could become desperate. Orphans might be taken in by relatives, but they entered these households as dependents, often treated less well than the family's own children. Their labour was used, but their welfare was not a priority. The overall experience of childhood in a medieval village was thus one of gradual but steady incorporation into the survival economy. Children moved from being fed and cared for to contributing slightly to working substantially, a progression that was efficient for household survival but demanding for the children themselves. The cost children paid was measured in curtailed childhoods, in bodies used for labour while still developing, in educations limited to immediate practical needs, in futures predetermined without their input. They paid in lost potential, in paths not taken because they were never available, in the surrender, before they could even recognise what was being surrendered, of the possibility of choosing their own way. Yet children also received things of value: practical skills, knowledge of how to survive, membership in families and communities, the certainty of belonging somewhere, even if that place was constrained. The cost was high, but what they received, while not what we would wish for children, was what the medieval village could provide. They grew into the predetermined world, and most accepted it as simply the way things were, because they knew nothing else and could imagine little different. To grow old in a medieval village was to enter a phase of life where the costs of survival became particularly acute, precisely at the moment when one's ability to pay them was diminishing. The elderly faced a peculiar paradox. They had successfully borne all the earlier costs we've examined, yet their reward for survival was often a period of increased vulnerability and dependence. The transition to old age was not marked by a specific birthday, but by the gradual decline of physical capacity. When a person could no longer perform the labour their survival had always depended upon, they entered a new relationship with the household and community, one tinged with both respect for accumulated years and anxiety about productivity. In families where land passed from father to son, the elderly parent theoretically retained some authority and security. The father, who handed over the family holding to his heir, might negotiate terms, a portion of the harvest for his support, a corner of the house to live in, specific care obligations. These arrangements, sometimes recorded in formal agreements, attempted to ensure the elderly parent wouldn't be abandoned. But the security such arrangements provided was only as good as the family's willingness and ability to honour them. A son who resented his father, or whose own family struggled to survive, might provide minimal support. The elderly parent, no longer controlling resources or able to enforce claims through labour, had little recourse if treated poorly. Elderly women faced particular vulnerability, especially widows. A woman whose husband died lost whatever security his position provided. If she had adult sons, she might be supported in their households, but she entered as a dependent subject to her son's wife, the daughter-in-law she might have once supervised. The reversal of authority could be difficult for both parties. Widows without sons to support them faced genuine hardship. They might try to maintain a cottage and small garden plot, surviving on the margins of the village economy. Charity from the church or neighbours might supplement what they could produce themselves. Some worked as hired labour when their bodies still permitted, accepting whatever tasks the elderly could manage. The economic calculation surrounding elderly survival was straightforward if harsh. They consumed resources while producing less. In households where everyone's labour was essential for survival, supporting someone who couldn't contribute fully created genuine strain. The elderly themselves were aware of this, conscious of being burdens on families that could barely support their working members. This awareness carried psychological weight. To have spent a lifetime working, to have raised children and maintained a household, and then to become dependent, to feel oneself a drain rather than a contributor. This diminishment of status and purpose was its own form of cost. The elderly paid for their survival partly in dignity, in the changed regard with which they were viewed and treated. Yet the elderly also possessed something valuable, knowledge accumulated over decades of experience. They remembered previous famines, past weather patterns, the outcomes of different farming decisions. They carried the living memory of the community, knowing its history, its genealogies, its traditions. This knowledge commanded a certain respect, even from those who found the elderly burdensome. Grandparents played practical roles in households. An elderly grandmother, too frail for field work, might still watch small children, freeing their mother for heavier labour. An elderly man might do sitting work, sharpening tools, weaving baskets, teaching young boys basic skills. These contributions, while less than full adult labour, were not nothing. The elderly also served spiritual and social functions. They prayed for the family, prayer being work they could still perform regardless of physical limitations. They were closer to death, and thus, in the medieval understanding, closer to the spiritual realm. Their prayers were thought to carry particular weight. In the community, the elderly sometimes served as mediators or advisors, called upon to remember precedents or confirm customs. Their testimony about how things had always been done carried authority. In disputes about boundaries or traditional rights, the memory of the elderly could be decisive. But these valued roles didn't eliminate the material reality that supporting the elderly required resources. Food given to someone who couldn't work in the fields was food taken from active workers or growing children. The fire that warmed an elderly person consumed wood that was always scarce. Every resource allocated to elderly care came from a pool that was never adequate. The physical challenges of old age were endured with minimal medical intervention. The aches and pains accumulated over decades of labour became constant companions. Joints stiffened, making movement difficult and painful. Vision declined, limiting useful work. Hearing faded, creating social isolation. These changes were accepted as natural, but that didn't make them less difficult. Chronic conditions that develop with age, arthritis, heart problems, digestive issues, were managed through folk remedies and acceptance. Pain was endured because there was no alternative. The elderly learned to pace themselves, to work within their limitations, to accept that they could no longer do what they once had. Falls and injuries, which might be minor setbacks for younger people, could be catastrophic for the elderly. A broken bone might not heal properly, leaving permanent disability. A bad fall could mark the beginning of final decline. The fragility of elderly bodies meant that accidents had consequences out of proportion to their initial severity. The winter months were particularly hard on the elderly. The cold affected aged joints and bones severely. Respiratory illnesses, always dangerous, were especially threatening to those already weakened by age. Many elderly people who survived the autumn did not live to see spring, the winter claiming those whose bodies could not withstand its demands. The care of the dying, when it came, fell primarily to family members. An elderly person in final decline needed tending, feeding, cleaning, comfort. This care work, added to all other household responsibilities, was another cost of their survival, paid now by the generation that had once been cared for by the dying person. Death itself required expenses: burial, prayers for the soul, perhaps a small funeral meal for those who attended. Even in death, the elderly imposed costs on survivors, though these were accepted as proper obligation. The funeral rites connected the deceased to the community and to the church, ensuring proper transition from this world to the next. The possessions left by the deceased, meagre as they usually were, passed to heirs according to custom and necessity. The clothing might be reused, tools passed to those who could use them, any small savings distributed. Even in death, nothing was wasted. The material goods of the deceased were absorbed back into the economy of survival. But alongside these practical calculations ran deeper streams of feeling. Children who cared for aging parents often did so with genuine affection and sense of duty, not merely obligation. The elderly person was a link to the past, a repository of family memory, someone who had cared for the children when they were young. This emotional connection motivated care even when it was burdensome. Communities, too, generally tried to ensure that the elderly didn't face complete abandonment. Neighbours might check on an elderly widow, bring food occasionally, ensure the fire hadn't gone out. The church taught that caring for the elderly was a spiritual duty, and this teaching had real effects on behaviour. Some elderly people maintained their independence longer than others, managing small households or contributing gardens until quite advanced ages. These robust elders were valued examples, proof that long life need not mean complete dependence. Their continued competence delayed the full weight of elderly vulnerability. The relationship between the elderly and children in the household could be warm. Grandparents told stories to grandchildren, passed on lore, provided attention that busy parents couldn't spare. The elderly person who might be burdened to adults could be beloved companion to children, creating intergenerational bonds that enrich the household. In some regions and periods, elderly people might enter religious houses, monasteries or convents that accepted elderly lay people who donated their property for care in their final years. This provided security for the elderly person and resources for the institution, though it was an option available only to those with property to donate. The attitude toward elderly survival reflected broader medieval understandings of life's purpose. Old age was preparation for death, and the elderly were expected to focus on spiritual preparation, making peace with enemies, confessing sins, readying themselves for judgment. the costs of physical survival were balanced against the importance of spiritual preparation. Yet there was also recognition that the elderly, having survived so long, had earned their keep through decades of prior labour. An elderly person who had worked hard throughout life, raised children, contributed to the community, had claim on support in their final years. The obligation was not just familial, but communal. This person had helped sustain the village, and the village owed them sustenance in return. The experience of old age thus combined vulnerability with a certain status. The elderly had survived where others had not, in itself an achievement. They had lived long enough to see children grown, perhaps grandchildren born. They had accumulated the wisdom that comes from decades of experience, but they had also entered a phase where everyday survival came at costs they could less easily pay themselves, making them dependent on others' willingness to bear those costs. For the elderly themselves, the final cost of staying alive was accepting this dependence, this reversal of lifelong self-sufficiency. It meant acknowledging limitations, accepting help, living with the knowledge that one's continued existence was a burden on loved ones. This psychological and emotional cost, paid daily in small indignities and large dependencies, was perhaps the heaviest burden of all. Yet most bore it with a certain grace, understanding that this was the final stage of a life fully lived within the constraints their world imposed. They had paid the costs of survival through all the previous years, in labour, in surrendered freedom, in worn bodies and limited choices. Now, at the end, they paid in dependence, in diminished capacity, in the gradual letting go of life. And in most villages, most of the time, the community found ways to support that survival, honouring the implicit contract that those who had contributed across a lifetime deserved care when they could contribute no longer. No examination of what it cost to stay alive in a medieval village would be complete without understanding the spiritual dimension, the ways religion shaped life, demanded resources, provided comfort, and extracted its own forms of payment from those who lived within its embrace. The parish church stood at the physical and spiritual centre of village life, its presence a reminder that survival was not merely material, but also spiritual. The bell that called villagers to services was the voice of authority, of community, of the sacred, and also a reminder of obligations that had to be met regardless of other demands on time and resources. The tithe has been mentioned in economic terms, the tenth of production given to support the church, but understanding its full cost requires recognising its spiritual dimension. The tithe was not presented as a tax, but as an offering to God, a return of a portion of what God had provided. Refusing to pay was not just economically problematic, but spiritually dangerous, threatening one's eternal soul. The calculation was explicit. Give a tenth of your harvest now, or risk eternal damnation. For people who genuinely believed in heaven and hell, who understood death as a transition to eternal reward or punishment, this spiritual calculus made the tithe non-negotiable. The cost was immediate and material, but the alternative, risking one's immortal soul, was unthinkable. Beyond the tithe came other church fees. Baptism required a payment to the priest, small though it might be. It was a cost at a moment when families were already burdened. Marriage brought its own fees. Burial in the churchyard, essential for Christians, required payment. These life cycle events, spiritually necessary, carried financial costs that families somehow had to meet. Holy days throughout the year meant days when labour was forbidden. These feast days and saints' days, scattered through the calendar, were times for worship and rest. A spiritual benefit, certainly, but also days when work didn't progress. For people living close to subsistence, days without productive labour meant falling further behind on the endless tasks required for survival. The number of holy days varied, but could be substantial, perhaps 30 or 40 days per year when servile labour was prohibited. These were, in theory, days of rest and spiritual refreshment. In practice, they were also days when the urgent work of the season waited, when crops needed tending but couldn't be tended, when time that could never be recovered was spent in enforced idleness. The church building itself was maintained through community labour and resources. The parishioners were responsible for the nave, while the priest maintained the chancel. Repairs, improvements, renovations, these required contributions of labour and materials from villagers who had little to spare. The pride of having a well-maintained church competed with the burden of providing for its upkeep. Religious education, such as it was, came through sermons heard at Sunday Mass. The priest's words, delivered in Latin that most didn't understand, then explained in the vernacular, conveyed the teachings that shaped worldview. These teachings emphasized accepting one's station, enduring hardships patiently, trusting in divine providence, and looking to the afterlife for rewards that this life denied. This message served multiple purposes. It provided genuine comfort, a framework for making sense of suffering, an assurance that hardship had meaning beyond itself. But it also reinforced social hierarchies, discouraged resistance to oppression, and made people more willing to accept conditions that might otherwise have seemed intolerable. Confession, required of all Christians at least annually, involved exposing one's sins to the priest. This spiritual unburdening provided psychological relief and assured people of divine forgiveness. But it also gave the priest intimate knowledge of parishioners' lives, creating a form of spiritual surveillance that reinforced clerical authority and social control. The fear of purgatory, the intermediate state where souls were purified before entering heaven, created markets for spiritual services. Prayers for the dead, masses said for souls in purgatory, indulgences that might reduce time in purgatorial suffering. All of these could be purchased or earned. Families spent resources ensuring that deceased relatives wouldn't suffer longer than necessary in purgatory's fires. The cult of saints provided both comfort and cost. Each saint had particular areas of patronage: protection for travellers, healing for specific diseases, help with particular problems. Appealing to saints required knowledge of which saint helped with what, and often involved promises, gifts to the church, pilgrimages to shrines, specific devotions. The spiritual help came with obligations. Pilgrimages, while spiritually beneficial and sometimes undertaken to fulfill vows or seek healing, imposed real costs. The time away from productive work, the expenses of travel, the risks of journeys in an era of poor roads and various dangers, these were substantial. Yet for some, pilgrimage was understood as necessary, either to fulfill a vow or to seek spiritual merit. The physical church building itself was a space that reinforced hierarchy even as it gathered the community. The wealthy might have special seating closer to the altar. The poor stood at the back or sides. Even in worship, social position was visible and acknowledged. The church was communal space, but not egalitarian space. The liturgical calendar structured time in ways that went beyond agricultural rhythms. Advent and Lent brought periods of required fasting, reduced food consumption, that was spiritually meaningful but also physically challenging for people already living on limited nutrition. The spiritual discipline of fasting imposed material costs on bodies that could ill afford additional deprivation. Yet fasting also created communal experience. Everyone participated in these seasonal disciplines together. The shared experience of Lent's restrictions, broken by Easter's celebration, created bonds and rhythms that gave life structure and meaning beyond mere survival. The cost was real, but so was the benefit of participating in something larger than individual existence. Religious festivals, Christmas, Easter, the feast of the village's patron saint, brought celebrations that provided genuine joy and community cohesion. These were times when better food might be available, when work paused for celebration, when the village came together in ways that transcended daily survival struggles. The festivals were high points in the year, moments of lightness in lives otherwise weighted with labour. But festivals also required resources, special foods, perhaps new clothes if possible, contributions to communal celebrations. The expectation of celebrating properly, of honouring holy days appropriately, created pressure to spend what could barely be spared. The spiritual benefit came with economic cost. The church taught resignation but also offered hope, the promise of heaven, of eternal life in a realm without suffering, where the hierarchies of this world were reversed and the last became first. This teaching provided powerful consolation. If this life was hard, it was also temporary. Justice deferred to the afterlife was still justice, still something to sustain hope. This teaching prevented despair, but also perhaps prevented resistance. If suffering was temporary and would be rewarded eternally, then accepting it patiently was reasonable. If the powerful would face divine judgment eventually, then seeking justice against them now was less urgent. The spiritual framework that comforted also constrained. The sacraments marked life's progression. Baptism welcomed the infant into Christian community. Confirmation recognized coming of age, marriage blessed unions, extreme unction prepared the dying for death. These rituals gave structure and meaning to human existence, connecting individual lives to the larger story of salvation. They were genuine comforts, providing context and significance to experiences that might otherwise seem random or meaningless. The local priest was a complex figure in village life. He was often from the village himself, or from similar circumstances, more educated than his parishioners, but not vastly different in daily life. He depended on their tithes for support, creating a relationship of mutual dependence. A good priest could be counsellor, advocate, teacher, and spiritual guide. A poor priest could be ignorant, grasping, or negligent, a burden rather than a benefit. The quality of spiritual life varied with the priest's quality. A conscientious priest celebrated Mass regularly, heard confessions attentively, baptized and married and buried parishioners with appropriate ceremony. A neglectful priest might serve multiple parishes, appearing rarely, performing ceremonies hastily, providing minimal spiritual guidance. Parishioners had little choice about accepting whichever priest they had. Monasteries and religious houses in the region provided other services: charity for the poor, hospitality for travellers, prayers for benefactors, sometimes medical care. These institutions were sustained by endowments and donations, some of which came from villagers. The support of religious houses was understood as spiritually meritorious, but also economically costly. The intersection of spiritual and material was perhaps most visible in beliefs about divine providence and supernatural causation. Crop failures might be understood as divine punishment for sin. Disease could be seen as test of faith or result of moral failing. This understanding gave misfortune meaning, but also added spiritual anxiety to material hardship. The fear of God was real and ever-present. Divine judgment awaited after death, and no one could be certain of their salvation. The best one could do was live righteously, fulfill religious obligations, earn spiritual merit through good works and proper observance. This spiritual economy ran parallel to the material economy, another ledger of debts and credits that had to be balanced. Yet this same framework provided structure that made life bearable. The rituals and rhythms of religious life, the communal nature of worship, the assurance that suffering had meaning, and that justice, if not in this life, then in the next, would prevail. These were genuine sources of strength. The costs of religion were real, but so were its benefits. The medieval villager lived in an enchanted world where the spiritual realm interpenetrated the material. Saints could intervene in daily life, demons could tempt, God watched and judged. This worldview made life both more frightening, spiritual dangers lurked everywhere, and more meaningful. One's actions mattered not just materially but eternally. The cost of staying alive thus included staying right with God, maintaining one's spiritual account along with material survival. This required resources, time, money, goods that could barely be spared. It required conformity to teachings that reinforced one's subordinate position. It required accepting explanations for suffering that made sense within a religious framework, but that might, in other contexts, have seemed like justifications for injustice. But the account was not entirely one-sided. Religion provided comfort in grief, structure in chaos, meaning in suffering, community in isolation, hope in despair. The cost was substantial, but for people who genuinely believed, and most did, the benefits were literally infinite. Eternal salvation outweighed any temporal cost. The price paid for spiritual security, however steep in material terms, was worth it for the promise of eternal life. Understanding the spiritual costs and comforts reveals another dimension of medieval survival, that life was not conceived purely in material terms, that survival of the body was inseparable from survival of the soul, and that the costs of existence were measured not just in labour and goods, but in right relationship with the divine. The regular costs of staying alive in a medieval village were heavy enough, but they constituted only the baseline. Beyond the expected demands lay the realm of catastrophe, events that swept away the carefully maintained balance between survival and disaster, moments when the accumulated efforts of years could be destroyed in days or even hours. Harvest failure was perhaps the most common catastrophe, happening with enough regularity that it couldn't truly be called unexpected, yet its specific occurrence remained unpredictable. A late frost in spring might kill young plants. Excessive summer rain could rot grain in the fields. Drought could wither crops before they matured. Hail could destroy a nearly ripe harvest in minutes. Each scenario brought its own particular terror. The calculations after a harvest failure were grim. The seed grain for next year's planting had to be preserved no matter what. Eating the seed meant forgoing next year's harvest entirely, converting short-term survival into certain long-term disaster. But protecting seed grain meant having even less to eat, spreading the insufficient harvest across more months than it could reasonably cover. The year following harvest failure was called the hungry time, when food supplies ran progressively lower. Autumn's meagre harvest would be supplemented with preserved foods, but these too had been affected by the poor yield. By spring, before new crops could be harvested, families faced genuine starvation. The cost of surviving a bad harvest was paid in hunger, in weakened bodies, in some cases in death. Famine, when harvest failures extended across regions or accumulated over multiple years, brought catastrophe on a scale that overwhelmed individual household resilience. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which affected much of northern Europe, killed perhaps 10% of the population. Those who survived paid enormous costs, in health permanently damaged by malnutrition, in communities devastated by loss, in psychological scars from having witnessed starvation. Disease could arrive suddenly, transforming the village overnight. Plague is the most famous medieval pandemic, but smaller outbreaks of various diseases occurred regularly. When sickness struck, it spread quickly through crowded households and close-knit communities. The costs included not just those who died, but also disruption to the whole survival system. Sick people couldn't work, but still needed care, draining household resources while providing no labour. The Black Death of 1347 to 1353 represents catastrophe at its most extreme. It killed perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. Villages were devastated. Some depopulated entirely, others left with too few survivors to maintain the agricultural systems that sustained life. The social and economic disruption was profound, affecting survivors for decades after the plague's passage. For individual families touched by epidemic disease, the cost was immediate and terrible. Watching family members sicken and die, helpless to prevent it, aware that one might be next, this was psychological trauma on top of practical loss. A household that lost its primary worker faced impoverishment. Children orphaned by disease faced uncertain futures. Fire was a constant danger in villages where dwellings were built of wood, thatch, and other flammable materials. Cooking fires, candles, hearth fires, all were essential but dangerous. A single spark in the wrong place could ignite a cottage. In dry conditions, fire could spread from building to building, consuming the entire village before it could be controlled. The loss to fire was total. The dwelling, the furnishings, the stored food, the tools, the clothing, everything the household possessed might be destroyed in hours. Rebuilding required resources the family typically didn't have. Community support could help, but a family burned out faced years of recovery if they recovered at all. Weather catastrophes beyond those affecting harvests also struck unpredictably. Flooding could destroy homes and fields, washing away topsoil that had taken generations to build up. Villages in flood-prone areas paid an ongoing cost in anxiety and periodic devastation. Rebuilding after floods required immense labour while also dealing with damaged land and destroyed crops. Storms could demolish buildings, kill livestock, and destroy infrastructure. A severe windstorm might tear the thatch from roofs, requiring immediate repair with materials that had to be gathered or purchased. Winter storms were particularly dangerous. A damaged roof during winter could make a dwelling uninhabitable, precisely when shelter was most necessary. War and armed conflict brought their own catastrophes. Armies passing through regions requisitioned food and supplies from villages. Soldiers might burn crops, kill animals, destroy property, either deliberately or simply through the chaos of military movement. Villages in contested border regions or on military routes paid regular costs in looting, destruction, and violence. Even small-scale violence, banditry, feuds between lords, roving mercenary bands, created dangers that villagers could not control or avoid. The cost might be livestock stolen, grain seized, family members injured or killed. The insecurity itself was a cost, fear constraining movement, requiring vigilance, disrupting the normal patterns of life. The death of a working adult in the household could be catastrophic, whether from disease, accident or other cause. Losing the person whose labour was central to household survival created an immediate crisis. Widows and orphans faced particularly dire circumstances. The community might help, but its resources were limited, and other households had their own vulnerabilities. Natural disasters specific to geography affected some villages. Landslides in mountainous areas could bury homes and fields. Coastal villages faced storm surges or gradual erosion. Earthquakes, though rare, could devastate entire regions when they occurred. Each geography had its particular catastrophe risk, and villages in those locations lived with awareness of potential disaster. Livestock disease, when it struck, destroyed wealth accumulated over years. A murrain that killed cattle or sheep eliminated both working animals and food sources. Rebuilding herds took years, and in the meantime the household lacked the animal labour for ploughing and the animal products for food and trade. Legal catastrophes, while less dramatic than natural disasters, could be equally devastating to individual families. A dispute with the lord that went badly might result in dispossession. Accusations of crimes could lead to ruinous fines or worse. Inheritance disputes might fracture families and deprive members of their livelihoods. The arbitrary power held by those above peasants meant that individual households lived always with vulnerability to legal disaster. The unpredictability of catastrophe meant that even careful planning and hard work couldn't guarantee survival. A family that had met all regular costs, accumulated small reserves, and maintained their household well could lose everything to events beyond their control. This uncertainty was itself a psychological cost, the knowledge that disaster could strike despite one's best efforts. Yet communities developed responses to catastrophe that mitigated if they couldn't prevent the worst outcomes. After harvest failure, lords sometimes reduced rents or provided grain from their own stores, not from kindness alone, but from recognition that dead peasants provided no future labour or rents. The church might provide charity. Neighbours might share what little they had. After fire or flood, community members helped rebuild. The loss was the affected households, but the labour of reconstruction might be communal. This mutual aid reflected both genuine compassion and rational self-interest. Helping neighbours recover meant maintaining community capacity and recognising that anyone might need similar help someday. The resilience shown in recovering from catastrophe was remarkable. Villages that had been nearly destroyed by plague or war would slowly repopulate and rebuild. Fields abandoned during famine would eventually be cultivated again. The human capacity to recover from disaster, to continue despite losses that might seem unbearable, was repeatedly demonstrated. But recovery always carried costs. The psychological trauma of having survived when others died, the grief of losing family and friends, the exhaustion of rebuilding from nothing. These marked survivors permanently. Communities that recovered physically might never fully recover psychologically from catastrophes that had fractured them. Understanding catastrophe as part of the cost of staying alive reveals another dimension of medieval existence, the precariousness of survival even when one paid all the regular costs. Security was always provisional, always vulnerable to disruption by forces beyond individual control. Living with this uncertainty, continuing to work and plan and build despite knowing it could all be destroyed, required a particular kind of courage or resignation or faith. Perhaps a mixture of all three. The medieval villager knew, in ways we perhaps don't fully appreciate, that survival was contingent, that the thin margins between life and death could be erased in a moment, that the work of years could be undone by circumstances they neither caused nor could prevent. They paid the regular costs of staying alive while knowing that at any moment an unexpected catastrophe might demand a cost they couldn't pay, a price that would exceed their capacity to meet it. Yet they continued, planting despite the risk of harvest failure, rebuilding despite the possibility of future destruction, maintaining households despite the ever-present threat of disease. This continuing in the face of uncertainty, this paying of costs without guarantee of return, this stubborn persistence despite knowing how fragile survival was. These were perhaps the deepest costs, paid not in labour or goods or even in bodily suffering, but in the psychic energy required to persist despite living always on the edge of catastrophe. Amid all the costs we've examined, economic, physical, social, spiritual, it would be easy to conclude that medieval village life was only hardship, only payment of prices for mere survival, but that would be incomplete. Within the margins, in the spaces between obligations, using resources carefully hoarded, people created lives that held meaning, joy and value beyond the baseline of existence. The festival days that we noted as economic costs were also genuine celebrations. After months of hard labour, holy days brought community gathering, special foods, perhaps music and dancing, time to rest and socialise. These moments of release were treasured precisely because they were rare. The ale drunk at Harvest Festival, the special bread at Christmas, the communal dancing at Midsummer. These were experienced with an intensity that abundance dulls. The household hearth was not just a practical necessity, but a gathering place where family connections were forged and maintained. The evening hours after the day's work, sitting by the fire's warmth, were times for storytelling, for teaching children songs and tales, for the small conversations that create family bonds. These moments cost nothing beyond the fire's fuel, yet they were where much of life's emotional richness resided. Music existed even in poverty. Simple instruments, whistles carved from wood, drums made from skin stretched over frames, voices raised in song, required no wealth to create. The songs sung while working, the melodies hummed by children, the communal singing at religious services, these brought beauty into lives that had little other access to it. Stories were the entertainment and education of communities without books, tales told around fires, legends of saints and heroes, memories of village history, comic anecdotes about neighbours. These circulated constantly, creating shared culture and knowledge. The skill of a good storyteller was valued, and those who could hold an audience were appreciated for bringing pleasure that cost nothing but time. Friendship, perhaps surprisingly, could flourish in circumstances of shared hardship. The bonds between those who worked together in fields, who helped each other through crises, who shared the experience of living in the same place under the same constraints, these could be deep and meaningful. The mutuality of understanding between people facing similar challenges created connection. Romance and love existed within the constrained marriage arrangements we've discussed. While marriages were often arranged for economic and social reasons, affection could and did develop. The couple who worked side by side through years of shared labour, who weathered crises together, who raised children jointly, they often developed genuine partnership and love, even if that hadn't been the marriage's foundation. The small acts of kindness between neighbours created a web of mutual support that made survival more possible and more bearable. Sharing a bit of food with a household in particular need, helping a sick neighbour with urgent tasks, watching someone's children in a crisis. These acts were both practical assistance and expressions of community care. Children's play, though limited by work demands, still happened. The games children created from nothing, dolls made from rags, balls from bundled cloth, imaginative play that required no props, brought joy. The laughter of children, their capacity to find fun even in difficult circumstances, added lightness to the village soundscape. The beauty of the natural world was available to all regardless of social position. The spring flowers blooming in meadows, the autumn colours of changing leaves, the stars visible in night skies unpolluted by artificial light. These could be noticed and appreciated even by those who owned almost nothing. Some medieval people surely experienced genuine aesthetic pleasure in their natural surroundings. Gardens, beyond their practical function of providing food, could also be sources of pleasure. The satisfaction of watching plants grow, the beauty of flowering herbs, the accomplishment of coaxing life from earth, these brought rewards beyond mere nutrition. The few precious flowers someone might grow, not edible, purely decorative, represented an investment in beauty for its own sake. Craft skill brought its own satisfactions. The spinner who produced particularly fine thread, the weaver who created an especially even cloth, the carpenter who made a tool that fit perfectly in the hand, these people experienced the pleasure of work well done. Pride in craftsmanship was one of the few forms of pride that could be safely expressed. Animals, despite being economic assets, were also companions. The oxen that ploughed the fields were known intimately, their temperaments understood, sometimes even named and spoken to fondly. The dog that guarded the house was also a presence that greeted one's return. The cat that controlled mice was also a creature that might sit by the fire and be petted. These relationships between humans and animals brought small pleasures. Humour survived even in hardship. People joked about their circumstances, about neighbours' foibles, about the small absurdities of life. Laughter, in the face of difficulty, was both release and resistance, a refusal to be entirely defeated by circumstances. The village fool or comic, if one existed, served a real function in providing entertainment and perspective. The success of a good harvest after months of anxious labour brought genuine joy. The moment when it became clear that the crop would be sufficient, that the family would eat through the winter, that survival was secure for another year, this was relief and celebration. The harvest feast, even in its obligations, also represented real accomplishment worth marking. The birth of a child, despite the dangers and the additional mouth to feed, was generally welcomed. The infant represented continuity, hope, the family's future, the celebration of a safe birth, the blessing of the child, the gathering of women to support the new mother. These rituals created community and acknowledged the importance of new life. Marriages, even when arranged, were occasions for celebration. The joining of two families, the beginning of a new household, the hope embodied in a young couple starting together, these were marked with whatever festivities resources permitted. The community gathering to witness and celebrate the union created bonds and memories. The church, despite all the costs we've examined, also provided genuine spiritual comfort to many. The assurance of being part of a sacred community, the hope of salvation, the structure of meaning that religious belief provided, these were real benefits for people who sincerely believed. The beauty of religious ritual, music, and sacred space could inspire and uplift even in poverty. Small possessions, few though they were, could be treasured. A particularly nice bowl, a tool that worked especially well, a piece of cloth in a favoured colour. These items, unremarkable to us, represented accumulated small choices and were valued accordingly. The care taken with few possessions reflected both necessity and appreciation. The transmission of knowledge from generation to generation created connection across time, teaching a child the skill one had learned from one's own parent, passing on stories one had heard in youth, sharing the accumulated wisdom of experience. These acts linked past, present, and future, giving individuals sense of place in a longer story. The moments of rest, sitting in shade on a hot day, warming by the fire on cold evenings, lying down after exhausting labour, held their own pleasures. The body's relief at cessation of work, the mind's brief freedom from planning the next task, the simple sensory pleasure of comfort after discomfort, these were appreciated precisely because they were finite and hard-won. The pride of having paid the costs, of having survived another season or year, of having maintained the household and met obligations, this was its own reward. The knowledge that one had done what was required, that one's family had food because of one's labour, that one had fulfilled one's duties, this brought a sense of accomplishment and dignity. The community identity, the sense of belonging to a specific place with a shared history and culture, provided rootedness. People knew where they came from, who they were in relation to others, what their place in the community was. This certainty, however constraining, also provided security and identity that placelessness denies. Understanding these margins where life happened reveals that medieval villagers were not merely surviving, but living, experiencing the full range of human emotion and connection within their constraints. The costs they paid were real and heavy, but what they built with what remained to them was also real. They loved, laughed, created beauty, found meaning, maintained dignity, and passed on to their children not just techniques for survival, but also culture, knowledge, and community. The lives they lived were shaped by costs we would find unbearable, constrained by limitations we can barely imagine, yet they were human lives, lived with the full complexity that implies. The margins were small, but within them people created the texture of existence, the relationships, rituals, small pleasures and meanings that made the cost of survival worth paying. They stayed alive not just to stay alive, but to live, and in the small spaces their circumstances permitted, they did. Individual survival in a medieval village was nearly impossible. Community survival was difficult but achievable. Understanding what it cost to stay alive requires examining not just individual or household expenses, but the communal systems through which costs were shared, burdens distributed, and mutual aid organised. The village was not merely a collection of individuals, but a collective survival mechanism. The open field system, with its scattered strips and common lands, enforced interdependence. Your strips lay among your neighbours, making isolated farming impossible. Ploughing, planting and harvesting followed communal schedules because individual deviation would disrupt neighbours. This agricultural interdependence meant that the community had to function cooperatively or not at all. Ploughing was often a cooperative endeavour. A full plough team, the oxen and equipment needed, might exceed what one household owned. Neighbours pooled animals and labour, one household providing oxen, another the plough, a third the human labour. These arrangements required trust, negotiation and maintained relationships across years of mutual dependence. Harvesting mobilised the entire community. All hands were needed to bring in crops before weather destroyed them. Families helped each other in sequence or worked together on communal harvests. This cooperation was both practical necessity and social obligation. You helped your neighbours knowing you would need their help in turn. The common lands were managed collectively. Decisions about when to open fields for grazing, how many animals each household could pasture, when to cut hay. These were made communally, sometimes through formal village meetings, sometimes through informal consensus among leading households. The rules governing commons required collective enforcement. Fence maintenance, ditch clearing, and road repair were communal responsibilities. These tasks benefited everyone and couldn't be effectively done individually. The village organised work parties, with labour allocated according to land holdings or custom. Failure to contribute could bring sanctions from the community. The church building was maintained through community effort. The parishioners collectively kept the nave in repair, providing labour and materials according to their means. This shared responsibility for the sacred space reflected and reinforced community identity. The church was ours, in a way little else was. Mutual aid in crisis was an informal but powerful system. When fire destroyed a house, neighbours helped rebuild. When sickness struck a household, neighbours might help with urgent tasks. When death took a working adult, the community might ensure orphans weren't abandoned. This assistance was neither automatic nor guaranteed, but it existed as a recognised obligation. Lending networks operated within the village. In a bad year, a household might borrow seed grain from a better-off neighbour, repaying after harvest. Small loans of tools or animals allowed households to function despite limited individual resources. These networks of reciprocity created webs of debt and obligation that bound the community together. Information sharing was a form of mutual support. Knowledge about weather patterns, crop diseases, animal care, herbal remedies, all circulated through the community. Experienced farmers shared knowledge with younger ones. Women passed on skills around food preservation and textile production. This collective knowledge base elevated everyone's capacity. The communal herd in villages where it existed meant that animals were watched by someone on behalf of all. Households took turns providing a herder, or a designated person watched all the village animals for some form of compensation. This collective management of livestock was more efficient than each household independently watching their animals. Festivals and celebrations, while we've noted their costs, also functioned to maintain community cohesion. These gatherings reinforced social bonds, allowed relationship maintenance, and created shared experiences that defined community identity. The investment in festivals paid dividends in social capital. Conflict resolution within the village avoided involving external authorities when possible. Disputes between neighbours were mediated by respected community members, solutions negotiated that preserved relationships. This internal conflict management kept the community functioning and limited external intervention. The village leadership, headman, reeve, or whatever local title, served as intermediary between villagers and lords. A good leader advocated for the community's interests, negotiated reasonable obligations, and distributed burdens fairly. Leadership itself was a form of community service, though it came with status and often some advantages. Reputation within the community mattered enormously. Someone known as reliable, helpful, fair in dealings could draw on community support more easily. Conversely, Someone with a reputation for shirking obligations or taking advantage found less help available in need. Reputation was a form of social capital earned through years of proper behaviour. Gossip, while we might view it negatively, served important functions in village life. It circulated information, enforced social norms, and maintained the collective knowledge of who could be trusted. The village's awareness of everyone's business limited privacy, but also created accountability. Collective memory preserved knowledge essential for survival. The old people who remembered the last serious drought, the family that recalled where the boundary stones had been before they were moved, the accumulated wisdom of generations. These were community resources. The elderly served as living libraries of essential information. Social pressure enforced cooperation. Someone who consistently refused to help neighbours, who took advantage of communal resources without contributing, who violated community norms. They faced sanctions ranging from gossip and shaming to more formal penalties. The community had ways of enforcing cooperation on those inclined to free-ride. The village was also a marriage market, with families making matches within the community or with nearby villages. These marriage connections created kinship networks that overlaid other social bonds. Families related by marriage had additional reasons to support each other. Children in the village were informally supervised by all adults. A child misbehaving might be corrected by any adult who saw it, not just their parents. This collective oversight of children meant that parents could work with less constant worry, knowing that the community watched children collectively. The sick, while primarily cared for by family, also received community attention. Neighbours might visit, bring food, help with tasks the sick person couldn't manage. Chronic illness that exceeded family capacity might draw on wider community resources. The boundaries of family care and community care were permeable. Poverty, when it struck a household, was partly ameliorated by community support. The poorest villagers might work for others for food rather than wages, receive charity from better-off neighbours, or receive church alms. While such support was insufficient and came with a loss of status, it prevented the absolute destitution that isolated poverty would have meant. The skilled specialist within the village, the blacksmith, the carpenter, perhaps a healer, provided services that benefited everyone. Their specialisation was possible because the community supported them, providing food in exchange for specialised labour. This division of labour, however limited, increased community efficiency. Common rituals, rogation days when the community walked field boundaries, harvest thanksgivings, communal prayers in times of crisis, reinforced collective identity and shared purpose. These rituals reminded individuals that they were part of something larger than themselves. The sharing of joy as well as burden was part of community life. Others celebrated when a wedding occurred, rejoiced at a birth, participated in marking harvest success. The emotional life of individuals was partly community property, with neighbours expected to share in both grief and celebration. Yet the community was not idyllic. Competition for resources created tensions. Personal enmities existed and sometimes festered across generations. Power imbalances within the village meant that communal benefits were not equally distributed. The wealthier and more influential families had more say in communal decisions, more ability to shape collective action to their benefit. The village could be oppressive in its conformity. Deviation from norms brought censure. Those who were different, through disability, temperament or choice, might find the community more burden than support. The collective could be as much about control as about assistance. Conflicts sometimes arose over communal resources, disputes about grazing rights, disagreements about field management, arguments over common land use. These conflicts could divide communities, creating factions that undermined cooperative function. The mechanisms for resolving such disputes didn't always work smoothly. Witchcraft accusations, in periods when they occurred, often arose from community tensions. The person accused might be someone marginal, someone who had quarrelled with neighbours, or simply someone vulnerable. These accusations revealed the dark side of close-knit communities where personal conflicts could escalate dangerously. The village's closure could also be constraining. Everyone knew everyone else's business. Privacy was minimal. The same community that provided support also exercised surveillance. Living always under neighbours' observation meant that individual freedom was limited by collective judgment. Despite these tensions and limitations, the community remained essential for survival. The costs of staying alive were too high for individuals or even households to bear alone. Only through collective action, shared resources and mutual aid could the village sustain itself. The community was imperfect, sometimes oppressive, but it was also necessary. Understanding the communal dimension reveals that medieval survival was a collective achievement. The costs were borne partly by individuals and households, but also by the community as a whole. The mutual support systems, while imperfect, distributed burdens in ways that made survival possible for more people than could have managed alone. The village was not just a location but a social organism, with each member performing functions that benefited the whole. The reciprocity, the shared labour, the mutual aid, these were investments that paid returns in collective survival. The cost of maintaining community, in time, in compromise, in subordinating individual interests to collective needs, was one of the prices of staying alive, but it was a cost that generated genuine benefits. The community was where individual survival became possible, and where life happened in its fullest sense. Despite all its costs and constraints, the medieval village as a community was the structure within which people not only survived but created lives worth living. Having examined the many costs of staying alive in a medieval village, economic tributes, physical labour, social constraints, spiritual obligations, vulnerability to catastrophe and more, we face a difficult question. Was it worth it? This question is perhaps unanswerable in any definitive way, but attempting to consider it reveals important truths about human life, about values, and about how we might understand those who lived so differently from ourselves. From one perspective, the costs seem overwhelming. The labour was endless, the freedoms minimal, the security fragile, the hardships severe. People paid with their bodies, worn down by decades of work. They paid with their time, every hour claimed by necessity. They paid with their potential, talents unexpressed and possibilities unrealised. They paid with their autonomy, living lives largely determined by circumstances of birth rather than choice. If we calculate in purely material terms, the balance seems negative. Most people lived their entire lives in poverty, never accumulating surplus, never achieving comfort, working until their bodies failed them. The labour invested far exceeded the material returns. The system extracted most of what people produced, leaving them with the minimum for survival. Yet people continued. Generation after generation, they bore the costs and maintained the communities. They didn't simply resign themselves to misery, but created lives that held value and meaning. This persistence suggests that the calculation, from their perspective, was more complex than mere material accounting. The value of life itself must be considered. For people with deeply held religious beliefs, earthly existence had infinite value because it was the test that determined eternal fate. The suffering of this world was finite. The joy or torment of the next was eternal. From this perspective, any earthly cost was acceptable if it secured heavenly reward. This religious framework wasn't merely consolation for the oppressed, though it served that function. For believers, it was genuine truth about reality, enduring hardship patiently, accepting one's station, helping neighbours, maintaining faith. These actions had cosmic significance. Life's worth wasn't measured only in comfort or freedom, but in spiritual progress. The modern secular perspective struggles with this calculation. We can't share the medieval certainty about afterlife, so the costs they paid seem to purchase nothing but more hardship. But we should resist the temptation to condescend, to imagine they were simply deluded. Within their worldview, the calculation made sense. They lived in an enchanted universe, where spiritual realities were as certain as material ones. The value of family and community must also weigh in the balance. The relationships created, the children raised, the marriages maintained, the friendships formed, these had worth beyond material measure. People lived not as isolated individuals but as members of families and communities. The joys of these relationships, however constrained, were real. The love between spouses, even in arranged marriages, created value. The bond between parents and children, despite the child labour and early assumption of responsibilities, had meaning. The connections among neighbours, forged through shared experience, provided support and belonging. These relationships weren't mere compensation for hardship, but genuine goods that made life worth living. Achievement within the constrained possibilities available also held value. The farmer who managed to improve his family's position slightly, the woman who ran her household with skill, the craftsman who produced work of quality, the elder who was respected for accumulated wisdom. These people experienced the satisfaction of accomplishment within their circumstances. The small pleasures we've discussed, festivals, stories, music, beauty observed in nature, simple comfort after labour, while they might seem insufficient set against the costs, were perhaps valued more highly precisely because they were rare. The intensity with which limited pleasures were experienced might have created value that abundance dilutes. Dignity maintained despite circumstances has its own worth. The people who met their obligations despite difficulty, who helped neighbours despite their own need, who maintained standards of behaviour even when easier paths existed, they lived with integrity. This moral achievement, invisible in material accounting, mattered to them and gave their lives meaning. The transmission of life and culture across generations created value that transcended individual experience. People lived not just for themselves, but as links in a chain connecting ancestors to descendants. They preserved and passed forward the knowledge, skills, stories and community that would outlive them. Being part of this longer story gave individual lives significance. Yet we must also acknowledge that many people surely did find the costs excessive, the balance negative. Those who died young after hard lives, who watched children starve, who suffered chronic pain or depression, who felt the weight of oppression without access to consoling frameworks, for them, the calculus might have been different. Not everyone found meaning or value sufficient to justify the costs. The question itself, was it worth it, might be somewhat misplaced. Medieval villagers didn't have the option of deciding whether to pay the costs. They were born into circumstances that offered no alternatives. They paid the costs or died. The choice was not whether life was worth its price, but whether to continue living or to give up. Most chose continuation, but that choice was made in the absence of alternatives, not after weighing multiple options. From our perspective, centuries removed, we can see both the tragedy and the dignity of medieval village life. The tragedy is that people with full human potential, capable of so much more, were constrained to lives of labour and limitation, that their talents went undeveloped, their possibilities unrealised, their autonomy denied. The system that extracted such costs from people was unjust, and we should recognise it as such. But the dignity lies in how people lived despite these constraints. They created culture, maintained families, sustained communities, found meaning, and preserved values across generations. They demonstrated remarkable resilience, creativity, and strength. They deserve respect for having borne what they bore, and for having created lives of worth. Within circumstances we would find unendurable. The medieval village system eventually changed, transformed by forces including plague, economic development, social upheaval, and gradual shifts in power relationships. The descendants of medieval peasants would eventually live under different arrangements, with different costs and benefits. This transformation suggests that the medieval balance was not permanent or inevitable, but was eventually changed by human action and historical circumstance. Understanding what it cost to stay alive in that earlier world helps us appreciate what has changed and what remains constant. The basic human needs for food, shelter, security, connection, meaning are the same. The costs of meeting those needs have shifted but not disappeared. We pay different prices for survival now, some lighter than what medieval villagers paid, some perhaps heavier in ways we don't fully recognise. The medieval experience reminds us that humans can survive and create meaning under remarkably difficult conditions. It shows us both our resilience and our vulnerability. It reveals how systems can extract enormous costs from people, while also depending on their continuing cooperation. It demonstrates the importance of community, of relationships, of frameworks of meaning that make hardship bearable. Was it worth it? Perhaps the better question is, what did they make of it? And the answer is, they made lives. Difficult, constrained, costly lives, but lives nonetheless. They stayed alive not just in the biological sense, but in the full human sense. Thinking, feeling, relating, creating, believing, loving, hoping. The costs were real and heavy, but what they built with what remained to them was also real. Real families, real communities, real human lives lived with all the complexity that implies. We honour them not by romanticising their hardships or by pretending they lived in some golden age of simplicity. We honour them by recognising clearly what their lives demanded of them, by understanding the prices they paid, by acknowledging both the injustice of the systems that oppressed them and the dignity with which they navigated those systems. We honour them by remembering that they were people, that their experiences matter, and that understanding what it cost them to stay alive helps us understand both the fragility and the strength of human life. As we step back from this exploration of medieval village life, we find ourselves with a clearer picture of what survival cost in that distant world, a picture painted not in dramatic strokes, but in the accumulated details of daily existence, in the small payments made again and again, in the quiet persistence of people doing what they had to do to stay alive. The distance between that world and ours is measured not merely in centuries, but in fundamental transformations of how life is lived. We wake to alarm clocks rather than roosters and necessity. Our work, for most of us, doesn't wear down our bodies in the same inexorable way. Our children play through childhoods protected from labour. Our elderly can retire with pensions. Our harvests come from stores stocked by industrial agriculture. Our freedom of movement is limited more by economics than by legal restriction. Yet recognising the differences shouldn't make medieval villagers seem like aliens from another planet. They were humans facing the universal challenge of survival, with the resources and knowledge available to them. Their responses to that challenge, the systems they created, the communities they maintained, the meanings they found, were as sophisticated and complex as human responses to challenges generally are. Understanding what it cost them to stay alive creates a form of connection across time. We can imagine, however imperfectly, what it would have been like to wake in a one-room cottage as the fields called for attention, to feel the weight of obligations that couldn't be avoided, to love children knowing how vulnerable they were, to grow old in a body broken by labour, to live within constraints we would find intolerable, but which seemed to them simply the conditions of existence. This understanding generates a certain humility. Our own lives, however secure they might seem, rest on foundations we didn't build. The agricultural and economic developments that make modern life possible were built slowly, often at great cost, by generations who didn't live to see the benefits. We are beneficiaries of historical processes we didn't create and inherit privileges we didn't earn. It also generates gratitude. The complaints we make about our own lives, the inconveniences, the frustrations, the challenges, become relativized when set against what medieval villagers accepted as normal. This doesn't mean our problems aren't real, but it provides perspective. The gift of not having to pay the cost they paid is worth acknowledging. Yet we should be careful not to use medieval hardship to silence modern complaints. Each generation faces its own challenges and has the right to address them. Recognizing that our ancestors survived worse doesn't obligate us to accept present injustices. Rather, understanding the past can help us recognize which of our problems are truly problems and which are simply the friction of existence that every human life contains. The medieval experience also raises questions about our own time. What costs are we paying that we don't fully recognize? What prices does modern life extract that we've normalized? What will future generations, looking back at us, wonder how we endured? The distance in time can illuminate not just the past, but also the present, making visible what habituation has rendered invisible. The communities medieval villagers created within their constraints offer insights relevant to our own more individualized existence. They remind us that humans are social creatures, that survival has always been a communal achievement, that the relationships we maintain with others are not luxuries but necessities. The isolation that modern life sometimes creates contrasts with the forced intimacy of medieval villages. Neither extreme is ideal, but understanding both poles might help us find better balance. The value of work is another theme worth considering. Medieval villagers worked until their bodies failed, but they also experienced the satisfaction of accomplishment, of skills mastered, of tasks well done. Modern work, often abstract and disconnected from tangible outcomes, sometimes lacks the immediate feedback that agricultural labour provided. Neither system is simply better or worse, but understanding both helps us think about what work should be and what relationship we should have with it. The question of meaning is perhaps most complex. Medieval people found meaning in religious frameworks that most modern people don't share. Yet the human need for meaning, for understanding one's life as part of something larger, remains constant. If we can't adopt their specific answers, we still face their fundamental questions. Why am I here? What matters? How should I live? What am I willing to pay? And what costs are too high? The medieval village system eventually changed, but not smoothly or quickly. Centuries passed between the medieval period and modernity. The people who lived through those centuries of transformation paid their own cost for the changes that eventually benefited their descendants. Progress, when it occurred, was built on the accumulated struggles of generations who didn't live to see the fruits of their labour. This long view of history reminds us that change is possible but difficult, that systems can be transformed but not easily, and that the benefits of change are often distributed unequally across time. The medieval villagers' great-great-great-grandchildren might have lived freer, more comfortable lives, but the villager themselves paid the costs of survival under the old system. The eventual improvement didn't retroactively justify the earlier hardship, though it might give it some meaning. As we conclude this exploration, we're left with an image of countless individuals, most nameless to history, who lived and died in medieval villages across Europe. They woke each day to obligations they hadn't chosen, laboured to meet costs they had no voice in setting, created lives within margins so small we can barely see them, and somehow maintained their humanity through all of it. They stayed alive, and in staying alive, they sustained the human community across generations of difficulty. They were neither heroes nor victims, but simply people doing what people do. Working, loving, hoping, enduring, occasionally transcending and ultimately passing on life to the next generation, which would face its own costs and make its own calculations about what survival was worth. Their lives cost them everything: their time, their bodies, their potential, their autonomy. What they received in return was life itself, with all its pain and occasional joy, its endless demands and rare moments of rest, its certain burdens and uncertain rewards. They paid the price and lived the life that payment purchased. We remember them not with pity, which condescends, nor with envy for a simpler time that never existed, but with recognition. Recognition that they were people who mattered, whose experiences have value, whose struggles deserve our attention, and whose lives, despite all the costs they paid, were lived with a fullness and a dignity that distances of time and circumstance cannot diminish. In understanding what it cost them to stay alive, we understand something about what it means to be human, to persist despite hardship, to create meaning despite constraint, to maintain community despite scarcity, to love despite vulnerability, to hope despite uncertainty. These are the human themes that connect us across centuries, the constants within varying circumstances, the essentials that make life worth its costs in any age. And so we conclude not with judgment, neither of the system that extracted such prices nor of the people who paid them, but with understanding. Understanding deepened by attention, enriched by imagination, and grounded in the recognition that to be human is to pay costs for survival, and that how we pay those costs, what we create in the process, and what we pass on to those who follow, define the legacy we leave. The medieval villagers paid their costs and left their legacy. They stayed alive, and in doing so, created the possibility that we might someday understand, across the gulf of time, what their survival meant and what it cost. That understanding, imperfect as it must be, is perhaps one way we can honour the lives they lived, by seeing them clearly, by acknowledging what they endured, and by recognising in their experience something that speaks to the human condition in every time and place. Their story, quietly told, is a story about survival, its costs, its meanings, and its stubborn persistence against all odds. And in the end, perhaps that's enough. They survived. They lived. They mattered. The costs were real, the burdens heavy, but the lives they lived were human lives, and therefore worthy of our attention, our respect, and our thoughtful remembrance.